Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining our webinar on avoiding global growing pains. We've heard a lot of stories between the four of us about people who are trying to expand internationally and lose money, waste time, flop. And so we came together through an organization called Softland Partners, which is an organization that has now 14 meetups across different cities in the world. And we met and we said, hey, let's take this online and educate people on some of the best practices that we've seen. So thanks for being with us today. We want to make sure that any launching that you're doing is completely successful. So we really believe that if you make wise choices and you put wise processes in, you will have the best luck. So just, to level set, I'm going to talk a little bit about finding opportunities. And then we have Tim here who's going to talk about strategies and goals and how important that is to start with that. Then Andrew and Jamie are going to get into a case study and deep dive into a company that we changed the name just to protect the innocent. And then we'll build off of that of identifying the benefits and avoiding risks of going. And then I'll come back on and talk to you about multilingual communications. So I mentioned each of us here. I'm Wendy Pease from Rapport International. I'm very active on LinkedIn. So go ahead and connect with me there. We've got Tim who's talking next. He's our legal expert. He works for a firm that does global law all over the place, and he'll give a little bit of introduction on himself when he starts speaking. And you can read more about him on LinkedIn. I'm staying on this slide for a minute so you can take the time to jot our names down and go read more about our bios on LinkedIn. Jamie and Andrew are really the employment specialists and expansion and setting up. So while we're at it and you're connecting with us on LinkedIn, go ahead and find the chat and put your name and company name in here. We want this to be very interactive on chat. So put that in there and any questions that you're hoping to get answered out of today. All right, so let's talk about global opportunities. Companies that export or do global business, they're more profitable, they have higher revenues, they pay their employees more, they have more coverage in times of risks because they're diversified across, they're more competitive, they've got higher valuations. So it's really valuable to do. And unfortunately here in the US, less than 1% of the companies actually export. And to improve the balance of trade, the federal and state governments actually have a lot of supports to help companies do that. And if you just look at the numbers, look at the global population compared to the population in the US. If you're purely a numbers person, you can see that the fraction of the people live in the US. So why not expand to other places? The demand for US goods and services is very high. People are looking for things with the made in USA. They're looking for the creativity. They're looking for the foods and goods and services that are coming out of here. And if we talk about right now with what COVID is doing, it's actually smart to start looking at other places. The New York Times just came out with an article that said that Germany and China and Korea are economically coming out of the economic depression faster. They have more constraints on what people can do. China just tested a whole city of 9 million people because they had a little outbreak there. And other countries that are rebounding are Cambodia and Thailand, Japan, Croatia, Australia, and New Zealand. So there's plenty of opportunity. Now I want to go to this next slide because this is the number one reason. It looks like a mess, but it really is cool. It's the internet. We're seeing a lot of accidental exporters happening because they're on the internet, they're using it to their advantage, and they're actually selling online. So with that, let me pass this off to Tim. And I really appreciate Dave Meyer. It's good to see you on there. I see the chat group are going. And we'll get to the questions at the end. We've reserved time for that. So Tim, let me pass it off to you and you can talk about strategy and goals.
Great, thanks, Wendy. So thanks for setting the scene there and talking about the opportunities abroad. What we're going to talk about is setting the scene for the international aspects of your business, putting it into context, looking at the current global landscape that, as we all know, has shifted tremendously in the past 6 months, and then looking at some of the new opportunities that's created in different ways markets can be approached now, as that the markets have shifted quite a bit here. So there's a very shifting landscape, but some things really haven't changed. If we look at the first column there, the key driver is always going to be driven by revenue. Where's your market going to be? How are you going to approach that market? Where are your existing customers, and where do you see opportunity to really leverage any existing customers and grow in that particular region? Another driver alongside revenue is typically around talent, and this is something that's changed vastly. And the guys later in the case study are going to cover this in detail. But looking at where your talent sits, new ways in which you're able to access this talent. We've all been working remotely now for a long time and realize many jobs can be done anywhere. And once you kind of open things up outside of wherever your current geographical footprint is, creates a lot of opportunity to create a decentralized organization, or at least aspects of it, create a regional hub, or take advantage of government incentives around creating jobs in the wake of some of the economic challenges now. Looking at market approaches, the number one thing here still hasn't changed, and that's research. What makes sense for your company? Where do you currently stand? What makes sense for you short term? And then looking at a longer term time horizon. Where do you need to be in terms of your customers, your operations? How are you selling and getting your products to those overseas markets? And I always recommend companies talk to their peers, talk to people in your network, and see how are others approaching things. And it's worth checking that now, because as the market has changed, as COVID has impacted everything, the way things might have been done, or you might have gone about a typical expansion project or going into a new market, has changed vastly. And we'll cover that in more detail. I like to look at a few ways that's typically done, and that's organic growth, putting your own team in a market or structuring your organization in order to sell into a particular market organically. Another way to quickly enter markets is by an M&A transaction to acquire a company that's already active in a particular country or region that really ramps up your growth in that market, and you have a ready-made team, you have revenue, and can quickly scale. In some markets around the world, a joint venture makes sense. Typically market-driven, and finding the right partner and structuring that correctly is really key. And then there's a litany of other considerations to consider, whether that's the business environment generally, logistics, language, time zones, culture, tax, the list goes on. And then the other thing to mention here is the current scenario, whether you look at the coronavirus impact, how that's impacted us now, what will that mean short term, how will things change long term in terms of companies now that go to a remote first model, the way that people are able to engage global teams, and the way products are moved around the world. Brexit is something I've been talking about for a long time, being at a London-based law firm. 4 years on, Brexit has happened, but we're in a transition period, which ends at the end of 2020. So this will impact the way things are done tremendously. We don't know the full extent of that, and even the laws are still being finalized, and the negotiations are happening now. So watch that space, but it's going to happen within the next few months. Alongside this is the US-UK trade agreement that's being put into place, which could vastly change the way the two markets are able to operate alongside each other. And then we've had a bit of drama in this country as well around our elections, which has created a lot of uncertainty, whether it's the current administration or a future one. Things like immigration will definitely change. There's been new tariffs, those might go away. There have been tax cuts, those might go away. But then the other aspects of doing business here have changed. And I've seen many clients that are already anticipating some of those changes happening and are already making moves in the current environment. So alongside all this, it's created some new opportunities and then different ways that we've seen our clients and others in the market approach their global operations. I think the coronavirus has taught us a lot about building resiliency to diversify risk. If a pandemic breaks out in one region, can you still get your supply chain operational? Can you service your customers? Where are your people, and are they operational there? Building that type of a resilient global organization becomes even more important now. We've seen the ability to sell internationally in a way we haven't been able to before, whether it's from remote, e-commerce, digitizing our sales processes, or digitizing products in the way that Wendy mentioned at the outset. I think decentralized teams and remote working is here to stay, maybe not the extent of what it is currently or has been, but it's definitely going to be a component of all of our workforces, and rolling that out globally is going to be an important aspect of how we access talent, because it opens up a whole range of quantity, ability to get quality talent at a lower cost in many cases. And we know the immigration environment is a massive challenge right now, getting your people where they need to be around the world, and hiring people in markets where they already sit starts to make a lot of sense. And then, like I mentioned earlier, the government incentives are coming and definitely will be growing. And then a few of those new approaches we're seeing is creating regional hubs of talent in specific markets, kind of a hub and spoke model of an entity in one location and employees around that, whether that's going to market in a particular area or just having a remote software development team that happens to sit in a different market and you're able to work with them as part of your organization. Selling from afar, new market entry processes, like I mentioned, looking to de-risk your business by building that resiliency with a global operation, not reliant on a particular market or a particular team in a particular jurisdiction. Supply chains have changed massively, and I think we're all looking at how our organizations get what we need in the global supply chains. And then resiliency is key, but alongside that is flexibility. And flexibility is something we're going to come on to quite a bit, especially around our teams and how organizations are able to get people where they need to be, bring them into their organization, have them deployed in the market, and do so in a way that creates flexibility if things change. As we've seen, things can change rapidly in the current environment. So one overarching thing to mention is plan ahead. It goes without saying, in any of these contexts, whatever you're looking to do, ensure that you're giving it as much thought to any other aspect of your business that you've looked at domestically. When you're looking internationally, it becomes even more important because it is a very different playing field. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Andrew and Jamie to pick up on the employment mechanisms in a case study.
Excellent. Thanks, Tim. Yeah, hi, Jamie Neely here. I think really where, the next steps are for any company that's looking at kind of the global opportunity that's out there, it's starting to understand what mechanisms are available in order to best service what their strategic advantages might be in those specific mechanisms. So there's quite a few to start with, and really it starts with what we've seen, Andrew and myself, 3 main mechanisms, and each carries their own really good results, and then also have kind of their downfalls in certain situations, depending what the company is looking to achieve. And so starting with really the least, I guess the more flexible or the most flexible one, but also the most risky, is the independent contractor route. We've started to see, especially due to COVID-19, a lot of companies starting to outsource some tasks that don't necessarily warrant a full-time employee, but are looking to accomplish some specific things for the company where they can find talent at a cheaper rate in a different country. And so typically these independent contractors are going to be paid hourly. They're not going to be, that salary full-time 40 hours per week person. They're also not going to be receiving the same sort of benefits that a full-time employee is. The company is looking again for kind of that cheap employment option that's able to accomplish a very specific project in a specific timeline. And after that timeline is complete, that contractor will then move on to a new project. Really, the second bucket that we typically see is international PEO, which stands for Professional Employer Organization, or more accurately within the international space, Employer of Record. This is where companies are starting to transition and recognize that, okay, we have found some talent, possibly within a contract or engagement, where we'd like to bring this person on full time. We would like to supply them benefits in order to make sure that they're secure in this unknown time of a pandemic, that they're receiving things like benefits, on-time payroll, making sure that they're paying into each local tax system correctly and compliantly as much as possible, but they're not quite ready to make the full-term investment by setting up an entity. So this is a great flexible option that brings a high level of compliance, but does not offer the full benefits of an entity kind of setup and support solution, which Andrew is the expert on, and I'll let him provide those benefits there.
Cool. Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, as Jamie was talking about, the international PEO or employer of record model is great for when you're testing the waters in a certain country. If your team grows to a certain size, or you're generating a lot of revenue, or there's senior management activity in that country, then you want to look at setting up a legal entity, and that's going to keep you compliant with HR law, corporate law. Is definitely the way to go for when you're sure that you're going to expand into that country. Like it says on the bottom there, there's more cost associated with this option, and kind of a longer time to market entry. But it can be more cost effective in the long run, and it's also going to keep you fully compliant with HR law, corporate law. Not a lot of risk of getting into hot water with the government. I did want to touch on, there's also an option that's kind of in between the PEO and full legal entity setup that's called a non-resident employer registration. And this is also called a payroll registration in some places. It's basically registering your HQ, so whether that be in the US or wherever it be out of the country you're expanding into, you can register that entity to provide payroll in the other country. It works similarly to PEO, but is a little different. You have a direct employment relationship with the employee. There's also going to be more administrative burden with the NRE, but it doesn't bear, fully going into here. If you have any questions on it, feel free to get in touch with me.
Excellent. Yeah. So in order to explore the mechanisms that are available and what a company would typically evaluate to figure out which one they'd like to utilize in a specific jurisdiction, we're going to utilize the case study of ARMCO here, which is a company that's focused on telemedicine practices, especially due to COVID. We've known that companies have been impacted in a negative light, but where we've seen a large uptick on that is going to be kind of the telemedicine, anything that's med tech, biotech, what have you, just due to the viability and focus on health that the global population has right now. And so ARMCO is one that has been or taken advantage of the pandemic in a specific light here, where they've been very successful within the United States. They've been able to generate a decent amount of revenue thus far. And really what they're offering is, it looks very similar to kind of a ZocDoc, where they partner with local practitioners to be able to supply end clients a safe and healthy alternative to going into a hospital or their local practitioner's office, to be able to walk through just kind of some standard check-ins if they have a cold, and be diagnosed for specific ailments where it's not necessary for them or their family to go through that risk process of actually traveling to a hospital. And so they've seen the ask, I guess, within different regions to be able to take advantage of this service in different locations. And so they've always entertained an expansion strategy, but COVID-19 has really increased or brought that timeline up in an expedited fashion to be able to take advantage of the need on behalf of clients, and really the doctors that are struggling right now with making sure that they feel or that they can relay the safety over to their end clients and their patients.
Yeah, that's a little bit about the background. And when they're looking at why they're expanding, they have proprietary technology and processes that give them a market advantage. Like Jamie said, there's regional differences and language differences that are important to cover during the sales and customer success processes. They haven't been able to provide the level of support that they need in those regions where they see a lot of demand and see a lot of potential for growth. So they're looking at expanding and establishing a presence in those areas to give them a little bit more of the support that they need. Their analysis showed that they could gain market share in some countries that are adjacent to their hubs. So they're looking at UK and Hong Kong to kind of set up as hubs. And then countries around there need a little bit more regional support. These salespeople have networks of doctors in those countries that are they can tap into to kind of increase revenue. And then also the customer success function, language support, knowledge of the healthcare system in those regions becomes pretty important.
Perfect. So this might look very similar to all of you if you're working on behalf of clients or you are an end client, right, that are looking or have gone through international expansion before. But typically the executive team are going to be the ones that are saying, okay, great, this is our expansion plan. We want to move into these new countries. However, we don't know how to execute that. And typically they'll go and put that project on the shoulders of their HR team to say, listen, we've got this strategic initiative. Can you go do the research to figure out what we need to do in order to make that happen and what the most viable options are? And I think, Andrew's going to pop up a poll here, but we've started to see an integration of other teams that are getting involved in this analysis more so than ever, because it does fall on the shoulders of the entire company rather than the HR team. So we're going to pop up a poll here to just ask what you all have recognized as who are going to be the leaders or the teams that are in charge of this project as we continue to move forward. So go ahead and answer that poll. We'll take a second to pause here before we move on.
A lot on their plate domestically. So when it gets pushed off to, okay, figure out how we hire 20, 30 people in Hong Kong, how we open up regional sales offices, it puts a lot of stress on them. So there's, shameless plug, people like Jamie and myself are around to help you kind of guide through that. But, there's a lot to consider when going into other countries, which Tim is going to cover a little later on. But just a little food for thought.
Excellent. So really the next process, or the next step within that process, I should say, is great. We've located the teams that are going to run with this project, but what sort of information do they need to find out so that we can make the most educated analysis on which employment mechanism we're going to use for each location, given our company's priorities and what we're looking to achieve with this international expansion? First and foremost, really, it's understanding how many employees are we looking to place within each location. Not only is this going to help you figure out a recruitment strategy, but it's also going to help you figure out, what employment mechanism is best suited for you. As we had talked about within the slides above, each of the employment mechanisms themselves kind of lend their specialties within a specific employee headcount. And so once you start to move in and establish that more firmly, then that'll start to really shed light on that pretty naturally. And then the second, I think, most important question is, what is going to be the function of each of these locations? And what's the functions that each of these employees are going to be carrying out? If you're looking to establish something more formally where you're going to have a multitude of people across different departments that are trying to accomplish the company's strategy within a different location, those are going to be key answers that you're going to need to then bring to those, or your teams are going to need to bring to your executive team and really produce a diagnosis on which mechanism to utilize. And then I think, in terms of a company, a high growth company in particular, like ARMCO, that doesn't have a whole lot of capital to waste, they need to make sure that every single dollar that they're spending is going to be a great investment, no matter what they do, right? So what they or the project leaders need to come to a conclusion with is, what is the investment that the company's prepared to utilize within each location? All of these answers should help you build out a project plan with some conclusive information on, great, this is the best way to move forward for our company with our expansion strategy abroad.
Share the answers to the poll.
Yeah, let me see. They should be on the poll tab there.
Yeah, they're there. I'll quickly share them.
I'll
quickly share them just as Andrew's about to jump in here. So it's interesting that we actually saw from a breakdown, the majority of you said that operations is really leading these sort of international expansion projects, and they're tied to finance. And then the second, or I guess third most popular, was the other. So I'd be interested from the audience about what that other was. If you could provide that in the chat, that'd be fantastic to understand which other departments you've seen get involved with these sort of projects. Go ahead, Andrew.
Cool. Thanks, Jamie. So with those questions in mind that Jamie went over on the last slide, it's important for companies to, like he was mentioning, do an analysis of those kind of criteria, and that's going to help guide what the solution is for them. So with the example of ARMCO, they went through the analysis of how many employees they're planning to have in each location. That's driven by the demand and the sales growth that they can have in there, and then the supporting staff around that. So with that in mind, they've already decided that the UK and Hong Kong are going to be kind of their regional hubs. Those include, senior management, sales employees across all different departments, admin and support employees. And that's going to be about 20 to 30. So that's a pretty large team. And given the work that they're doing and the expertise that they've got, that's a couple of triggers that answer those questions Jamie was going over. Spain and the Netherlands, those aren't going to be as large, but they are going to be headed by a sales director, so kind of senior level management. And they don't need administrative or R&D staff, but they're going to be important sales hubs for the EU. So a lot of revenue generating out of there, a lot of that support and expertise, which is important for the sales and customer success teams. Looking at some of the smaller regional sales offices, so Italy, Ukraine, United Arab Emirates, Japan, and Indonesia. These are places they've identified where there could be more growth in sales, but this is where they're having difficulty servicing those regions at an HQ location, just because of regional specialties, the way the healthcare system works, not being able to engage with the teams of healthcare professionals that they'd like to. And then also, language and kind of cultural support too. They're having difficulty growing there. There's not going to be an office in these locations where there would be in the other ones. So no place of business that the field reps are going to on a daily basis. They're out in the field making a lot of sales calls, really generating the revenue there. So given this kind of information, thank you. This is going to be the solutions that ARMCO arrives at. So for UK and Hong Kong, given the number of employees, the roles that are going to be there, senior management, sales, customer success, it makes sense for them to have a full legal entity. The team is really large, over 5-10 employees. It includes revenue generating employees, like I mentioned, senior management, and those are going to be their hubs for the region. So that shows the governments of these countries that they're participating in pretty heavy commercial activity there. There's probably going to be revenue associated with that, and they've got to comply with corporate and tax law. For Spain and the Netherlands, there's going to be fewer employees, but there is still going to be senior management activity, those sales directors there. There's going to be a fixed place of business, so one building that the employees are going to. There's customer success there. It's also revenue generation. These are all indicators that, again, heavy commercial activity is taking place in those countries. The government's going to want their fair share of that. For Italy and the Ukraine and UAE and Japan and Indonesia, however, since the circumstances are a little different, I'll let Jamie take away why PEO is the best fit there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Andrew. So international PEO and EOR, specifically for these countries here, are the best option compared to the others, and also compared to an independent contractor, simply due to the company's priorities. They want to make sure that, of course, these people are going to be full-time employees first and foremost. Therefore, an independent contractor solution wouldn't work. They don't want to have any misclassification that would flag from the local government's perspective, non-compliance. And so in order to make that happen, they're going to use the employer of record service to be able to have these employees out in the field, make sales, pay them correctly, also offer them those benefits that are allotted to a full-time employee, such as health benefits, right? Making sure that they're taken care of on that front, and that they look and feel very much like an employee of the company that's headquartered back here in the United States. And first and foremost, the low number of employees, it's what's going to lend this EOR model most handsomely to this situation in these locations. There's not any need to make an investment to have or to set up a legal entity in these locations to house these low numbers. As Andrew had stated, they're going to be on the road, they're out in the field making cold calls to doctors to be able to come onto the service. And so because these are really markets of testing, if you will, to see if there's any viability or if they need to pivot quickly. EOR is a great solution to offer that flexibility in case one country like the Ukraine doesn't work out. The company can quickly, ARMCO can quickly come back and reevaluate and say, okay, Ukraine didn't work out. Let's pivot and move towards a different country and see if our product is going to be more receptive there than over in the Ukraine. And so that's why that employer of record model lends itself to those specific countries.
To structure their international business and kind of figured out what the entities are going to be or the employment relationships are going to be that they put in place. Now they start to do a lot of the meat of the work and figuring out how to set up and manage their global workforce. There's a ton of stuff to go over in here, so I'll pass it off to Tim.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Jamie. There is so much to cover here. So I'm a lawyer and done this for about 12 years, advising primarily fast growth companies, expanding into new markets and growing. But getting the employment aspects right from the outset, as the guys just covered, but then also operating with a global team and getting it right. As you might know, employees outside the US have a lot of rights. Hiring and firing can be a challenge, and managing that is a key part of getting it right globally. Another thing is all the legal aspects and other considerations to have in mind. So I'll just briefly touch on some of those, but won't go into a ton of depth here, but just want to kind of set the scene and lay the landscape for that. So from an employment consideration, we talked about the contractor versus employee, what makes the most sense, kind of a part-time person, 1099 equivalent to kind of test things or do part-time work versus an employee that might be going to market in a particular place. Another thing to think about here is how you structure that team, whether you send anybody from HQ from an immigration perspective to go and carry the flag for the company in the new market, hire the team, help to get the culture right, and help scale that operation. They know the company, they're a trusted party, and they can really go in and take that over. Or you have somebody that might have the local knowledge. They know that country, they know how to sell in that market, they can build a team, they know how to manage a team within that market. So getting that right's an important consideration, and different approaches work for various companies. The curveball to think about, though, is travel feasibility and the challenges of immigration currently. So in many cases where you may have sent somebody in country, I've seen companies now either do things from afar or hire locally as the easy alternative to have somebody on the ground in the market there. Also worth keeping in mind that an overseas team and a remote team is something that we're seeing more and more of as we're moving to these work from home environment. So keeping that in mind as you look at your global employment landscape is important. Hopefully at some point in time, it'll be easier to move people around, whether part-time or full-time expat packages to get people into the markets, but that may change, and that's obviously something impacted by the election too, especially for companies bringing people into this country. So first thing to keep in mind for managing a global team is that outside the US, the general rule is there's no at-will employment. So hiring and firing is treated very differently outside the US. Wherever that person is based and doing the work is what local employment law will apply. Keep in mind that outside the US, most regulations are much more employee friendly. So they protect the employee, not the employer. So having a contract that's localized to the rules in that market really protects you, the company, from those rights and really sets the relationship out right at the beginning. I've seen many cases where, especially an American company, will give a one-page offer letter to a foreign employee. One, they won't know what it is because they're used to a 25-page employment contract. But two, it's not going to have anything in it to protect the employer, and it will be all the default statutes that protect the employees. So definitely get an employment contract. And then with those employees, there's a wide range of requirements, whether it's notice periods that create a longer time frame for hiring people or that need to be built into contracts, specific requirements about paid time off, holidays, what kind of benefits, pension requirements. There's a lot to consider there. Think about what your benefits are in the US. In many cases, you have things like government provided healthcare, so won't need to consider that. But there are some market benefits you might want to include. And then a lot of my clients are fast growth tech companies that offer stock options in the US. In many cases, those work great overseas. In some cases, there are very tax efficient ways to structure those, like EMI options in the UK. In other countries, they are very highly taxed, let's say, especially at grant, so not even exercise. So it doesn't even make sense. You're better off just paying people more at the outset, not tying comp to stock options or even commissions that in some cases get taxed higher. And then the thing that we're seeing arising now are people that are stuck in countries. So many people returned home during the pandemic or have chosen to do their job from a different country. This creates a ton of employment and tax issues. A few things to highlight there is typically you've hired somebody in a particular country. If they go somewhere else for a period of time, there's a point at which that local country's employment laws will start to protect them. Additionally, the tax authorities in those other countries will become a bit more interested, and you may need to pay payroll taxes in another country. You may hopefully have tax treaties. It's getting a bit tricky. A lot of companies are struggling with this right now. When you hit about a 6-month threshold in a different country, that's usually when that other country's rules will kick in. So worth keeping in mind as people are moving around in the current environment. Just a few other things around employment is looking at how you're structuring the agreements to have probationary periods that give you more flexibility, termination restrictions around working for competitors, trade secrets, things like that. Flexibility is very key, and the case study we just covered is highlighted that. But having the remote teams or that hub with a spoke model in various markets seems to work really well. And I think in the current environment, this is how we'll go. We won't have people all sitting in the same office or in the same location, but people gathered around particular regions or markets, but can work pretty seamlessly and do come together as a company, but can be more deployed into market or do their job from different places. With work remote and not being based in offices, there are a lot of health and safety considerations, and there are new regulations coming in, especially across Europe, that are protecting employees and requiring employers to provide quite a bit more to their employees who are now working from home. There have also been a number of furlough programs, some part-time statutes that have come in. So I think we're coming out of a lot of that now, but this has been a very shifting landscape recently. And it's definitely the thing that's been keeping our employment teams busier than ever is, okay, we think we know how we're going to either go back to the office on a part-time basis or have these remote teams, but how do we do this in a compliant way? What are the policies? What needs to be in our handbook? And how do we treat these people? So worth giving a lot of thought to that. And then that key issue at the bottom is what I mentioned for people that are returning home or doing their job from a different market than from which you hired them. So beyond that, there's a lot to consider from a legal standpoint. I'm just going to spend a couple minutes here. This is really just to highlight some considerations to have in mind from an operational standpoint for a business. I'd be bereft without mentioning privacy, which has become an even more important consideration every single day that goes by. It always was an international problem, let's say, for a company from a compliance standpoint. But with CCPA in California now in force and state-specific regulations coming in, it's starting to impact how we do business domestically. And certainly once you go outside the US, you start to hit GDPR in the EU and then different jurisdictions that have pretty strict privacy requirements. And places like the EU have a 4% of global revenue fines. So it's worth taking seriously and at least doing something to comply. I mean, that's always my advice is do something, give some thought to your data that you're collecting, how you're using it, and try to put some precautions in place and have some policies there. Most of the time, this will apply to personal data of, let's say, EU residents under GDPR. And it's about how you collect the data, the policies you have, how you're storing it. There are provisions around breaches and certain precautions that need to be taken there. And then it can get very much into the weeds when you're in this scenario with ARMCO, who is taking probably a lot of customer data and a lot of medical data that their doctors are collecting from patients that they might have on their servers. And this is becoming really important for how they would structure their business, especially, let's say, in the EU, where you're going to have very strong privacy requirements. They may even need to restructure how data is collected, what they do with it, anonymizing it, putting some precautions in place. Just mentioning in the employment context that data subject access requests from employees are starting to happen more and more, especially in a termination scenario where things might not be going well. The employee can ask for all of their data that the company has on them. And if it's a regulation like GDPR, the regulation applies to the employee data as well, not just customers or other people that they're collecting. So it's really important to remember that that employee data matters and needs to be treated properly, and also that the employee has a right to that you might be asked very short term to provide, and there are fines and consequences for that. Transfers of data either between the EU and the UK post Brexit and from Europe into the US has changed dramatically just in the past 3 months. There was a Schrems 2 decision about transfers into the US, so that's in a state of flux, and people are figuring out what the right solutions are for that short term and then long term. And then post Brexit transition period, EU data into the UK, the way that that's treated will likely change. Just to mention, protecting IP outside the US is even more important, especially around a brand. So if the brand is important for your company, one, does that brand work? Does it have some different connotation that doesn't quite make sense culturally? And I'm sure Wendy can talk about that in depth. But also, are you protecting it in a way that if somebody is using it, you could have cyber squatters registering domain names or using it in a different market? Giving some thoughts how you're going to protect that globally from the very beginning, or as you're beginning the international expansion journey, is really important. You may have other IP from the business standpoint, whether it's patents, if you're, let's say, life sciences, or in the case here of ARMCO that may patented some process, but likely have a strong trademark. They've probably copyrighted some of their software and are looking to roll this out and looking to protect their IP, maybe even on a jurisdictional basis if they're looking at APAC and the European market, to start there and then think more globally beyond that if they're successful. Doing it in turn can be a good way to sell. How you enforce that's important too. It can be trickier outside the US, so worth keeping that in mind. For somebody like ARMCO that is selling to consumers, or at least they're providing a solution that then goes to end consumers, it's really important that there are very strong consumer regulations outside the US. So the way in which you sell, the way in which you collect the data, the way in which you treat customers, there are a lot of requirements around that. So that's definitely a red flag if you do sell to direct consumers. B2B contracts and selling B2B is a bit more straightforward and more about what's your standard contract you're using? Where's the choice of law? Do you have a localized version you use for a particular market because it gives you a better negotiating position instead of requiring people signed up under New York law, or you have a US style contract in a foreign market? It's worth thinking about that. And for ARMCO selling into doctors and clinics, they should probably have a somewhat localized contract to sell to them. And then any specific regulatory requirements, licensing or product requirements, somebody like ARMCO in the medical field will definitely have that. If you have a physical product, there's likely CE markings, packaging requirements, and things to keep in mind. There's a litany of global compliance issues, whether it's around the supply chain, anti-bribery, anti-money laundering, anti-corruption. Tax structuring is an important part of this, worth doing, especially if you're successful outside the US. I definitely recommend starting slow, getting some basic tax structure in place between the US and your foreign operations. But then as you scale up, to get a more efficient structure in place will make sense at some point. And then rationalizing the footprint of the office. We're working differently. Do you need a physical office? Having that footprint match how your teams will work now and for the long term, definitely worth considering that. So we looked at operations and localizing that for the market, but what about your communications? Wendy now will look at your global communication strategy and how this fits into the overlay of what we've covered so far.
Okay, so I need to start out. I want your involvement in your answers here in the chat group. Who remembers the Lone Ranger? Yes or no to the Lone Ranger? I want to see who remembers them, because I have a funny story. Okay, we got some yeses. Oh, Sophie doesn't know. It's an old-time Western movie. Hi-ho, Silver. That's right. Okay, so the Lone Ranger was a TV show, and he had a best buddy. in the US, he was called Tonto. Yes, you didn't, it was a US TV show. And when I lived in Mexico as a kid, my younger brother liked to watch The Lone Ranger. And Tonto in Spanish means stupid. And so my dad walked in when he was watching the show one day and he said, "Hey, it's the Lone Ranger and Tonto." And my brother turns to him and he says, "He's not Tonto, he's Kimosabe." And so, even back then, the TV producer knew not to call the best friend, the Native American who rode around with the Lone Ranger, Tonto in Spanish, because it would have a bad influence. Well, I started researching this, trying to figure out where Tonto came from and if that was a very discriminatory term, but it wasn't. It came from a Native American language, a couple of languages that are Kimosabe, which starts with a K. And it means either companion or best friend or somebody who walks and speaks softly. So there's a lot of different meanings to it. That wasn't Spanish. And then there's also a saying in Spanish called Quino sabe, which is kind of like that knowledge when you wink at somebody. So there's a lot to goes into communications and understanding your audience. Well, this company is a US company, and a lot of people in the US say, well, we do our business in English and that's okay. Well, can you? No, you can't. Because let me go back to this slide. Over 90% of the people want to have information in their own language. Over 70% are going to spend a lot more time. Over half will spend more money. So people want to understand and have it safe. So I went back to the ARMCO target country slides that Jamie and Andrew did. And just looking at this, I can see the different languages that are going to come up here. You're going to have British English, which we've done translations from American English into British English and vice versa, because if you need something localized, it has to be appropriate. You got Spanish, Dutch, and then you've got all their small other branch offices that you're going to need to communicate in language. And when I looked at their strategy and what they were talking about, I'm always clued into that. As a translation company, we want to start with the strategy, understand what they're trying to communicate. Then we look at process technology to get the quality that they need. And what stood out to me here is that they're going to have regional sales teams and field sales teams, and they're going to be selling into local markets with doctors. And that they're all going to be doing their business in their native language. So they're going to need something to bring them in, teach them, and retain them. And then they're also working with consumers. So that's telling me they're going to need a platform. And there's local regulations and customs that they're going to have to deal with too. So right now, I know this company is going to need translation because they're not going to be able to handle it all on their own. It'd be hard to handle. So no, you absolutely can't do it in English. You have to do it with human translators if you still want high quality. And we'll get into that a little bit more. So here's where we get into it. Google Translate machine translation. I talked to a project manager the other day who said, "Oh yeah, I'm creating this. Well, won't the internet or technology just translate what I'm trying to do with my product?" And I kind of chuckled and I said, "No." And he'll find out the hard way. You can't do that because there are big problems. And so we have a lot about this on our resource center or learning library on our website. You can go read more about this in particular by visiting the bit.ly link 3NLJ45Y. So if you want to know more, you can go to that or you can reach out to me and I'll share the links. All right, so how do you simplify that journey? You've got to communicate across a lot of languages to a lot of people. So let's look at how you do that. And yes, Sophia is right, especially in the medical field. And when you're talking medical, legal, you're talking employment law, you're talking your branding. I mean, we've done a bunch of stuff on branding where we've tested brand names and taglines. And there's, again, on LinkedIn, we share a bunch of them that come up that are funny all the time. But one of my favorites is Electrolux. They didn't translate when they were coming from the UK into the US, and their tagline was, "It sucks." Well, you can imagine how well that worked in the United States. And that one on Nova, the car doesn't go, it's a fallacy. I can tell you more about that. Okay, so let's get into the strategy here. When you're trying to do multilingual communications, there's these different rings that you want to think about. And the first ring I talked about is you always want to understand your corporate strategy that aligns with your marketing strategy, which aligns with your multilingual communications. Technology and process, we help people figure out to make sure they get the quality you need. You get an email and you need to know what it says, sure, pop it into Google Translate. If it's something that applies, there are different ways that we can help you figure out how to communicate. Either put a landing page in answering questions, or you can use telephone to avoid the high expense of translating every email. Then you need to think about your audiences. Okay, and so on this one, they're going to be hiring employees, or they're going to have a PEO, or they're going to have subcontractors out in the different markets. You know, we clump them all in under employees because you're going to need to provide information to those people first so it can get out to your prospects, customers, and partners. And then you think about what the content is. So oftentimes people will lead with the content, and that's not really where to start. Okay. So there is a view from successful companies that when we hire enthusiastic employees and you train them well, then they're going to be excited about delighting your customers. And then you're going to get that flywheel spinning that's going to pull more people in. You'll have trusted excitement, and it builds on it all together. So that's the concept of the flywheel. So if you think about your employees and what kind of materials you need to communicate with, I put it into 3 buckets to match kind of the framework of what we're doing in the presentation. You've got hiring. How are you going to pull them in and screen them so you can bring them on? And then when you onboard them, how are you going to train them? How are you going to do the contracts and what's expected of them, accountability, and updating them with company information as you get new news to share. And building a strong culture code. This is, again and again, I'm hearing it about diversity, equity, inclusion, and working internationally. You know, if you can serve as a cultural broker, that is just going to also help with that flywheel and spinning it. And then you got to think about retaining them. If you've got the people in the US getting all the company news and announcements and updates and, client experience information, then you're going to have people that are going to feel like second-class citizens because they're not in the mainland office, the corporate office. So how do you pull all that support in, make really happy and excited employees so it turns over into the sales and the delivery that you're having? Then I used operations to think about the different categories before we get into marketing and sales. You've got legal, which Tim just talked a lot about. Then you've got delivery. I know of a company, I'll not name it, but they've marketed, I can think of 2 that are in the same industry. They're marketing platforms. And they've gone out to market internationally, but they haven't translated their platform. So it's really going to limit their access to who can use it and how well they'll do. So make sure you're thinking about all the back end things to support it. If you have CE marks, if you don't know what those are, you can contact him. He can tell you more about that. And then financial, what do you need to think about that in that area? Okay, so if we bring in another flywheel here, marketing and sales is going to be a key one, because if you're providing that information, then your salespeople and your employees are getting that information. One of the biggest mistakes that I see is a lot of people go, ooh, I don't know how to judge quality, so I'm just going to let the local market take care of that. Now, Tim, if you can put the link into the Global Marketing Show, it's a podcast that I do, and I interviewed Randy Rogers, and she was very articulated explaining this. They said they had a marketing manager in country do all the translation. So a week out of every month, she was translating materials. Rather, I say she, but it was in all their different countries. She was losing that week of work where she was supposed to be doing sales support, going to conferences, setting up meetings and doing all the sales support. Instead, she was translating it. And so she was doing it in Spanish for her country, and I'll just say it was Spain, but then also in Mexico, Argentina, Peru, or whatever other Spanish-speaking countries they're in, their local marketing manager was having to translate that. That is such a mistake, because it's a waste of time and money, and then you spend all this time with your corporate message, and you're not being careful to make sure that that's accurate. Okay, and a good way to think about marketing and sales is, what do I need to do to attract? What do I need to do to engage? And then how am I going to delight? And so that's, I put the different things in the different categories. And if I look at ARMCO, attract, they're going to need a good website with content on there and maybe a knowledge base, because this is going to be the basics that they're going to have for front facing. It's not a brochure anymore, it's your website. And then if you optimize that, then you can be found anywhere in the world, and then start tracking where that's coming in. And it could lead to information to what other countries you want to engage in. And then engagement tools, I would see them doing live chat, because they could have their salespeople monitoring that and making sure. They can easily do a chat bot and translate that material so it can assist. And then are they providing, is the corporate marketing department providing social media that the sales reps can use and post all the time, because that helps build incoming traffic to the website. And then on delight, are you getting feedback, and do you have inbound links, and what are you doing to actually help the customers that are coming in? So that's a good way to think about that. It's their starting step, and they can always grow from there. All right, so here we are at the end. We've got a few more. I've got some questions here that were sent in. So we will go to questions if you have any in there. And just a reminder that here are our specialties. So I'm language services and communications. Tim is global legal. You've got Jamie, who can talk to you much more in depth about a global PEO. And I think they're one of the best out there. And Andrew for international payroll, HR, and subsidiary setup. So please take our LinkedIn, connect with us. All of us agreed that we'd be happy to do a free 30-minute consultation on any of the topics. If you're not sure where it lands, take two of us up on the consultation. And then also in the handouts section, if you click over there, it's chat, polls, and handouts. You will see that we each put a download up there. So if you want to have information more about our companies, you can certainly go over there. So I will click back to chat to see questions. One, Tim, I will hand this. So why don't we all come back on video? Tim, Jamie, and Andrew, can you turn yours back on? And I'm going to throw this one over to you, Tim. You ready?
Sure.
What's your view on what the election is going to do to the value of the dollar?
We should get a Forex expert on this one.
Yes.
Yeah, tough to say. I mean, we have a lot going on with the U.S. election. Depends on what direction that goes. I think once Brexit hits, certainly with the pound and euro, there might be some movement there. U.S. dollar, though, totally dependent. I think if we had a Forex expert here, I'm sure they'd have a view one way or another, but that's above my pay grade as a lawyer.
Andrew, anything to add?
Expansion perspective, not really. I mean, it's going to be interesting. I think it's going to be really dependent on who wins the election and kind of the outlook of that. But nothing solid to add.
Yeah. I'm not going there. So, okay. So we had another question. And Jamie, we can hear you, right? Even though your video's not on?
Yeah, that's right. The webinar service only allows 3 videos at one time. So I'm still here.
Okay. So we'll let you go with this one then. Are you seeing any concerns about international companies working with U.S. companies?
Yeah. So just in terms of, I guess, the pandemic and what we've seen as a trend, there's a lot more focus from an international expansion perspective to hire local nationals. And in fact, a trend that we've started to see most recently is a lot of people who have run out of their visas in the United States have been kind of forced to move home to their country of origin and need to be able to continue to be employed. Their employer wants to offer some sort of solution. So international PEO is starting to creep up more and more as a solution to help them out in those situations. But I don't think that it's had any impact on companies abroad doing business with US-based companies. There's still, I think everyone appreciates the globalization and the benefits that doing business across seas and across country lines is able to offer their specific company.
Thank you. Andrew, let's build on that. What do you think all this virtual work that's going on is going to do with people working cross borders for a country, maybe if they lost their visa or just employment hiring for companies in the US for international talent?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And Jamie brought up the immigration piece, which I think is going to be really important. I don't think whatever administration comes in, I don't think that's going to be really top focus for them. So for the time being, in the short run, I think H-1B visas here in the US are going to be in question, and whether those employees go back to their home countries or go somewhere that's a little more forgiving for that type of visa like Canada. Kind of remains to be seen. But either way, that's moving people that are based in the U.S. internationally. I think with the push toward remote work, one of the selling points that we've had is you can take advantage of certainly countries where labor is less expensive, maybe more specialized in what you do. So that's one piece, but also, you can take advantage of people in countries where there's newer infrastructure. So broadband infrastructure makes things a lot easier. Some developing countries have even better broadband infrastructure because it's newer than the US or the UK or other kind of established nations. But yeah, we've seen a lot of companies that are pushing employment and hiring employees outside of the U.S. just because it's a lot more feasible now.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely something that's on the uptick.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we are at an hour now. Tim, do you want to go ahead and tell people about the Softland Partners Expo that's coming up, and then maybe drop the link in there?
Sure. So as Wendy mentioned, Softland Partners kind of brought a lot of us together that created this webinar. Sorry, just posting the link. There you go. So Wendy, do you have the dates in front of you for this? We're doing a virtual trade expo for Softland Partners. I think a few of us are speaking at it or have some colleagues speaking at it. And I think it runs 24 hours, 24/7 across a 2-day period, going across time zones and borders to bring together various people that are doing cross-border business from other regions, service providers like some of ourselves, to make connections in a virtual way that we wouldn't otherwise be able to. Oh, thank you, Sophie. Perfect. October 27th. There you go. And bring everybody together for that. My colleague Rachel Oakley is talking about global employment law. So, if you like this, there's plenty more to come on that topic. And I know some of the other people in the room here are also speaking as well. So it'd be a great place to check that out. If you're interested, connect and meet some other experts in the space or other companies that are looking to expand.
Okay, and then the last thing that I have was the global speed networking. We do that on the last Friday of every month. And so Tim is he just dropped that in there too. So that's coming up on October 30th. So it's for globally minded business people. And you get to meet with about 6 or 7 people for about 6 or 7 minutes. And that's been a good time, good feedback on that. So thank you. We're coming to the end. Feel free to reach out to us with any questions, and we really appreciate you coming today.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks.